Hello, this is Mark Mitchell. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 16, which is on politics and the economy. And we are going to look at several ideas throughout the chapter. Half of it is devoted to politics and the other half is devoted to the economy. We've had several chapters that kind of followed this format where we're really getting two chapters in one. But going to look at lots of ideas related to politics, which is really about how power is distributed. Our author has really been big on that throughout the textbook, and also with class, structure, and power were three big themes throughout every chapter as well. And then after the politics section, we switch over to the economy and just different things about the economic systems in the world and really which one contributes to less inequality than the other. So we've seen some of that before too. I think the chapter has more about politics than the economy. Our additional articles in the chapter that, again, a tradition of the author to help illustrate some of the concepts. And here again, we have three. And we'll get started now with really the content of the chapter. We start out with the definition of politics, and it is really how power is used. And our book indicates the struggle over power. So, many hands want power. And so they can bring about whatever changes they want to, which is really a definition of power. Power is the ability to bring about an intended outcome even when you have opposition. So politics is about the struggle over who maintains power. And then once we have that struggle over power, you can see the bottom four questions on this slide about exactly how that power takes shape and affects so many people and so many nations around the world. All right, we have a slide here about the systems of government. Here's the definition of power. I introduced that a little bit earlier on the previous slide. And then we look at governments who wield power. And then that authority, the reason our book mentions governments is it's considered to be the legal way to wield power. So unless it's a legal way, then we really are not going to be looking at it in this chapter. Max Weber, a name that we've seen plenty of times throughout the textbook, makes that point exactly, is that governments wield power legitimately, legally, instead of an individual or other group that would wield power in cases of a coup or some kind of illegitimate means. The different systems of government, our book has a small section on that, somewhere around page 412. But a monarchy is really a system in which there's one supreme leader. So whether you call it a king, a queen, a sultan, an emir, or something else, it's that government that is headed by a single person. Makes you think, really, I guess, maybe in some cases, a dictator. And we'll have another slide, I think, that brings out maybe a connection to that as well. We do see just a few of those left today. It seems like maybe in the ancient world that was a way to rule, but now you have monarchies that our book mentions are constitutional, and that's just simply more of a democratic way to rule. There's more people involved. There may be a symbolic figurehead in charge of the monarchy, but really that person doesn't have very much power. It's the people who make up the democratic organization of that system, that country that utilizes it. So, for example, what I've been talking about is the United Kingdom. That's the constitutional monarchy there. Of course, Queen Elizabeth is the most recognized monarch in the world, and she has very little power. As a matter of fact, without the government giving her kind of basically an allowance through taxes, she would not have really any income. And, of course, her son will take over when she dies, Prince Charles. So she's lived a long, long life, and so I guess Charles wonders if maybe sometimes if he's ever going to get to be king. The authoritarian government may remind you again of a system in which one or a few leaders rule, and they have great power that seems almost unlimited. Again, we can probably think of in the past of some great examples of some of the Roman leaders that had absolute power. I was thinking of Nero, for example, but At any rate, you can see the characteristics our textbook provides about these authoritarian governments ruled by a central party or even sometimes the military. They don't need popular support from citizens or voters. They don't really tolerate any opposition, so if you run afoul of them, then bad things could happen to you. And then they intrude and monitor the lives of citizens. So that may remind you of some of the political events that are going on in the United States with the NSA and how a lot of communications are monitored there, and that seems to be in contradiction to a lot of the ideals and values of the United States. We, of course, are familiar with a democracy, and simply leadership is through the people. We often think of majority rule. And our book does give us a few upcoming slides that really show where democracy is used in the world and where it's not, and maybe kind of a mix of democracy and some other type of authoritarian regime. That slide is next. Here it is, but you can see in our book the kind of the left-hand side is where you find more of the democracy, and then on the right-hand side you don't. It's more of a authoritarian type regime. Our book also mentions a direct democracy, and that's where citizens, they have a say-so individually, and they can participate in these political decisions. There may be town hall meetings or forums like that where citizens can vote, on a possible law or give their point of view known. A more common event is a representative democracy, and that's when citizens, they elect delegates who carry out the policy-making decisions. So those are also a couple terms to be aware of that our book actually uses. In our section here of political structure and political action, our book mentions plurality voting, and that's the system we're familiar with. We, not too long since the last presidential election, but the winner take all is kind of the idea, and maybe with the presidency that's not exactly how it works because of the electoral system there, but most other races I think do work on something more similar to that definition. I think Hillary Clinton actually had more votes than Donald Trump did, but in terms of how the electoral college assigns the kind of points there is how he actually won the presidency. There's a lot of debate about using that system. Do you override the will of the people? And one of the reasons we do have the electoral college system is because if you didn't use that, then really the most populated areas in the country would really determine the election. And so a lot of areas that didn't have a big population, their votes wouldn't be needed at all. It really would be a waste of time for them to vote. But people can differ on whether they think the electoral college is good or bad. But I think one of the things the electoral college does is it helps to really count everybody's vote on a equal kind of standing. The other idea here on political structure and political action is proportional representation. And that kind of incorporates what I've previously mentioned. But you get some sort of awarding of seats in government based on the percentage of votes that are received in an election. Should we have more than two parties? That's really what Figure 16.1 addresses. In the United States, we have the Republican and Democratic Party, but here's some other parties, minor parties in the United States that you may have known or may not. But, and we'll see around the world, there's other countries that they do have more than two parties, and so that's, one of the questions. Should the political system in the United States be dominated by the big two? Our next slide just gives us a little look outside the country. It looks at the United Kingdom and Germany and just shows you some of the other parties that are there. So the United Kingdom, they have, certainly a great number more, and then at least more than two there in Germany. All right, as we move on to political culture, political socialization is the idea that, in the United States we are taught really basic norms and expectations about political life and attitudes, and when it comes to politics and political matters. And we are, I guess with a lot of the media that we have seen and the expansion of media, that extends to where we're constantly kind of socialized to take one party side on a number of issues of daily life. When it comes to the spiral of silence, it's the idea that when your ideas are popular, you may talk about them, but if your ideas are not very popular, then you may not talk about some of your political beliefs or ideas for the sake of that they're controversial and that you may have to pay a price for that in your everyday life. Political issues and private matters, that's one additional section that our book talks about. And it is really, again, the idea that we want to look at politics and how much that it actually comes into our personal lives. Does it impact our choices in terms of the foods that we buy or the choices we make about what kind of career and work we do? Does it influence our personal relationships or many other matters? So how far does politics influence your individual decisions? If you're a Democrat or Republican, would you date somebody who is opposite of you politically? Do you think your political views shape the way that you watch television or what you read or things like that? Those are all kind of the matters that it's trying to bring about. Our next two slides just show us in different countries how people turn out to vote. And the United States is not on this slide because it's somewhere not quite about 67% of people vote in U.S. elections. But, does this surprise you about other nations and how the likelihood of these citizens going out and voting are all higher than what we find here on the second continuation slide of the United States? So once we get to, you can see on the bolded last column in the left-hand side, the United States is a little bit, about 2/3, a little over that. So why is it that people in the United States, you would think they should be higher on the list, but they're not? They're really toward the bottom half. We've got three theories that relate to power and politics here on our next slide. Pluralist theory is an idea that, just like in the United States, is based on pluralism, or the idea that it's based on pluralism, but the political power that's out there is just spliced up like a pie among many different groups. Power elite theory just says those that are rich and on top, they're the ones that have the political power, and it may be in business, it may be in government, it may be the military where this happens. I think there is a meeting of the world's most powerful people in lots of different industries, but it's called, I think, the Bilderberg meeting, and I think they have it about once every year in the summer, but it's a meeting really, I think, that goes along with this power elite theory, but whatever they discuss, I don't know, because I would never be powerful enough to be invited to one of those things. Class domination theory is really kind of like power elite, but it's just, again, those on top are the ones that dominate, that have the most power, and they're going to be able to exert their will in a number of ways. Here's a summary of those three. On this next chart, you can see the other additional information is which sociological tradition they fit under. So two of these, you could probably rightly deduce that they fall under social conflict theory, and then the pluralist theory falls under the functionalist. In our book next, we will look at the topics on this slide, class differences in political participation, and in particular what the book mentions here is that usually in the United States, political participation is influenced by social class. So those who are of a higher social class are more likely to get involved in politics or either vote. Their parents, if they're children, their parents get them involved early as compared to lower social class where that doesn't take place. We've also seen from prior chapters that those who are older or the elderly, they vote more often than the young in most cases. But that's some of the things we could say there when it comes to social class difference and political participation. Campaign contributions, lobbying, and policy outcomes is where those with wealth and power, they make a lot of contributions. We have another slide that I'll flip over to that really demonstrates that. So a lot of this is by business, and they will influence the elected officials with money and to get legislation that favors them, and that really works to the disadvantage really the American citizen who doesn't have money to influence government leaders. Now, here's a good example, just showing here on our chart, but this is almost over a 20-year period. But it's basically indicating that businesses have given over $7 billion to legislators in order to influence them about legislation. Our book mentions one area. If you have a specific concern, a single issue, or ideology, again, they still give about a third as much as those miscellaneous businesses that are listed on this graph. But still, all of this works to the disadvantage of most citizens, and those are the reasons, the citizens are the reason that the officials are elected and who they're supposed to be serving. But this just shows a multi-layered problem that's going to be very hard to solve. As I go back one slide, the last topic our book mentions there was inequality, power, and politics. And again, we can see this next slide, figure 16.4, just shows, for example, that those on top with power, with money, and all that, they just continually seem to be doing better, get the breaks, and that's really what this slide looks at, is that those who got the biggest tax breaks were in the group that made the most. So again, in keeping with the theme of our book, that is the inequality that our author disagrees with, or our authors disagree with, and it ought to be different to where they believe these breaks should go to the other groups rather than the group on top. This next slide goes to that last topic about inequality, power, and politics, and you can just see how it's cyclical, and the idea that it's ongoing. Once it begins, it's kind of hard to stop, and it continues to grow. I think I can personally see that in some of my life, given enough of a time frame, a long enough time frame, you can see how or understand what the authors are trying to get to. Our book also has a significant section when it comes to politics and on the war and the military. So we all know what war is, but these conflicts among two different sides, two different groups, two different countries, whatever it may be. But we've seen the national security state, and that is simply in the United States, that is, but the government becoming more and more dominated by its foreign policy and military action and the gathering of intelligence that may lead to some of these conflicts. And so we do have a brief description of that in our book, and it used to be that we didn't have really anything like that in the United States, but then it was seen as a way to expand the country, expand the nation. That happened, and then as the years went by, as it got bigger and bigger, we have a quote there from Dwight Eisenhower about 50 years ago, and he warned about this becoming bigger and bigger and how that might lead to some disastrous type outcomes or at least negative outcomes. But yet that seems at least to be the way that our book kind of relates a lot of that information. They call it the military-industrial complex, or that's what Eisenhower's quote was, and he just said that was going to keep becoming bigger and bigger, and that's actually what we see here in this chart. And again, it's 3 years old, but really shows, for yearly military expenditures, the United States and China make up half of what the world spends in military spending. So, do you need to spend nearly $1 trillion every year in the United States on military issues? That's at least the question I think that our authors want us to think about. And you can again argue about that, whether you think it's necessary or not. One thing I would suggest is that in the last few years it does seem like the world has become really kind of unstable and a lot of conflicts are popping up. Maybe it's always been that way. It's just we're hearing about it more now. But I think in part because the United States military doesn't seem to be maybe as feared as it once was, or maybe some of the funding there has been not to where other actors in the world, they feel like they can do things and not experience repercussions. And that may lead to other questions. Why should the United States police the world? That's going to be expensive and going to cost lives and other things too. And really, I think the issue that our authors take is, well, if you didn't have to spend that much money on the military, you could spend it in other areas of the economy, such as all these that are listed on figure 16.7. You could help so many people in the United States and then probably elsewhere if you just didn't have to spend that money every year on military. So that's why it's an important thing to talk about. Our book also mentions the politics of fear and civil liberties, and so we've also seen some of that, I think, earlier in the chapter, but part of it is if you can get the population to fear a certain topic, then maybe you can kind of get what you want. So our book does talk about, really for just a short moment or two, of how 9/11 really did introduce a new time period in our world, and how a lot of civil liberties were reduced in order to have security. So often people want their liberties, but when they think their existence is being threatened, they'll be glad to give some of those up for protection. Now, this goes back hundreds of years, but Thomas Hobbes, now this is not in our book, but he wrote a book called Leviathan, and that's really what he was arguing in a sense there, is that when you have a government, it provides that security that people need, but yet they have to give up some of their freedom. And that's what creates this Leviathan. And he would argue that the government authority is supreme authority. It's even more important than religious authority. But, these are not new ideas. It's just maybe it's the first time we've encountered it, but people have been dealing with it for, a long, long time. We also see news and the politics of fear, and so we have some pictures in our book and even a cartoon that really speak to that, where people are afraid and upset over certain types of things, whether it be an ideology or a religion or something else, and they may protest or have signs that really make people think about, what's going to happen. As we move on, our book talks about the socialization for war, and as one example of that, our book, really mentions how in our society in the United States that we appreciate and want to thank and celebrate people who have been in the military, who have given their lives or their limbs and blood. That's really the socialization they talk about. Maybe some of the holidays that we have, and some of the sayings about supporting the troops and hire a veteran and things like that. That's what they mean by socialization for war. To get citizens used to the idea that we're going to have to send men and women over to other places in the world and risk their lives to maintain some of the freedoms that we enjoy here. And then, of course, the soldiers themselves must be re-socialized in order to go and fight, to make decisions that could kill many people in a short period of time, but to accept these type of orders. All right, and then when we look at the military itself, some of the issues there, well, at one time, the military was simply just one group of people. It's usually people from the lower classes that fill the military, when it's usually a volunteer type scenario. If it's a draft, then you're going to have, a higher, other classes of people involved too. But if it's volunteer, usually the working class and lower middle class families predominantly make up those men and women that fight. Our book just gives us a brief history, and before women and same-sex oriented soldiers were allowed to fight, it was racially integrated. Even before the civil rights movement in the early to mid-1960s, the military was integrated racially, in about 1948. But that shows you the military was a little bit ahead of society at that time, or either they realized that they needed, some help, and that was a way to do it. All right, so those are a couple things when it comes to social inequality in the military, and how those in the upper class sometimes, for example, can maybe get out of not having to serve like others. A subject we're all familiar with, again, since 2001 is terrorism, but that goes back quite a while. Our book gives us, again, a brief scenario there, but during the French Revolution, that word of the Reign of Terror, I think, was the first documented use in history, so that goes back, 250 or 60 years ago. But the idea of terrorism is you have some groups, again, who are dissatisfied, but they target citizens, or what our book frames as non-combatants, to create that terror. So not only individuals and individual groups can engage in terror, but you can have state or governments that engage in terrorism. So right now it's the claim that Iran is the government that is the number one state-sponsored terrorism state in the world. I noticed I do like wrestling and keeping up with that, but I noticed that the WWE was invited to Saudi Arabia to give a show, and have seen that one group there, Al Qaeda, has said, well, that was, in there, I'm paraphrasing, but they were saying how terrible that was in their opinion, because their values were being destroyed by these anti-believers who were halfway naked, and there were young boys and girls from Saudi Arabia there being corrupted, but they basically wanted to have some violence perpetrated against the Saudi Arabian government, who again brought this entertainment group in from the United States, just as a way to maybe modernize their culture. But that was a terroristic threat by this group, this Al Qaeda group. Now, when you think about terrorists, our book gives us some bulleted items to think of. They're not crazy. These are maybe dedicated people to their religion, maybe in a twisted way. There's lots of groups out there, so no single face. Terrorists do not call themselves terrorists. They call themselves freedom fighters. We call them terrorists, and they probably have a negative name for us, and maybe one that I've heard is infidels. I mentioned about the wrestling thing, but I think that was the term that they used. But there's lots of terrorists all around the world. There's events happening every day. Some of the solutions, this is not in our textbook, but it says, well, hey, maybe if these people who are involved in terrorism had other opportunities, they would do that instead of engaging in terrorism. Maybe that's just the only way they can make money and make a living. So that's kind of an interesting idea. I hadn't really heard it phrased that way before. All right, so that brings our section on politics to a close, and now we got a shorter section on the economy. We've seen the economy before, but it was really that system in which you distribute, you consume, and then produce all kinds of goods and services. But the economy is really driven on consumption. A corporation is maybe a business that is involved in this too, but they are sometimes incorporated so that they are perceived as separate from the owners. That way, maybe the corporation, if they're ever sued, it just involves the assets of the business rather than one's personal assets as well. All right, as our book moves on just a little bit, it talks about the social economy and some features under that. One of it is social cohesion, and so it's just really the idea of trust makes it really run well. And so whether buyers and sellers, they have to kind of basically operate on trust, and they have to fulfill their promises in order for things to run smoothly. If they don't, we are really kind of in trouble. The economies and culture, maybe that wrestling story fits in here too, but it just looks at the idea that cultures value different features of economic life. So here in the United States, with capitalism versus other places in the world, that at least according to the perspective of our book, they value equality more than simply just making a profit. When you relate to economies and other social institutions, a lot of people say they don't want the government to be involved with their lives, but yet our book gives us maybe several areas to consider on pages 430 and 431 of how really the government is involved in all sorts of consumer transactions. And without maybe the government there to offer some protection, it really would be a vastly different experience, maybe no trust, and that would destroy the culture and the social cohesion that we previously talked about. The last bulleted item on the slide is very, I think, crucial to the author's point, but they would argue that it's not whether the government is going to be involved in your transactions, even as a business owner, but to what extent they are. We've seen capitalism and socialism before, and so one is in search of profit. That's capitalism. Socialism is where you get more protections and you don't fall as hard. There's probably very few places that are 100% one or the other, but they, kind of mixed systems. And our book later on mentions that. They call it mixed economies. You can see some of the differences between the two in this chart. We've talked about that really in some previous videos, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here. Our book just highlights just some of the advantages and disadvantages of these systems. And so capitalism in reality, it's hands-off. That's laissez-faire, or leave alone from the French. But it's the idea that you really let consumers decide what they want to do. Our book just mentions there were some individuals who were able to get in some industries and really make a lot of money compared to lots of people who didn't. So you either call them, if you admire what they did, you call them captains of industry, or if you don't really like what they did, you call them robber barons. But once somebody makes a lot of money, they pass it on down to their descendants, and that creates that cycle of inequality that they're also mentioning in under this section for capitalism and reality. So eventually, or at least according to our book, we see that things maybe with capitalism got to a point where they crashed, and then that's maybe where the Great Depression came in. And so the U.S. government intervened. They created a New Deal to help the massive amount of people in the United States who were without a job and unemployed. I think it was about a third of the nation just was out of work. And so that was the New Deal, and started Social Security, and then some legislation to help protect workers so that when things did if they did fall apart again in the future, people wouldn't have as hard a fall as they did in the Great Depression. So lots of people lost all their money and had nothing left over. They just wanted to prevent that again. I think the closest we've come to that is the 2007 and 8 recession. Now, call that a recession, not a depression. Recessions aren't supposed to be as bad, but tell that to some of the people who lost everything that they had and still struggling today 10 years later. So one of the things that led to the Great Recession was the housing bubble, and then that sparked a global economic crisis, and our book gives us several things to consider there as sources of the crisis, as to reasons why it happened. And really, if you want to summarize them, it's greed. It's the idea that people wanted to make money easily, cheaply. These on top kind of took advantage of people on the bottom. They lied, misled, misinformed. They took advantage of them in ways that really shouldn't have happened. That bubble, what is meant by the bubble is when the price of something really just climbs higher than it should be, and people continue to buy it, and that further inflates the bubble. And then there's a point in which the bubble bursts, and then the prices crash back down again. So that's, there's always been bubbles throughout history, but it's like people get so excited they keep buying instead of just pulling back. And that's really kind of weird. People will do that in investments, but they don't do that in their everyday normal behavior. For example, let's talk about gas. Gas prices are going up. Right now they're about $2.80. But imagine, the higher gas goes, people go out and buy more. That really just doesn't make sense. Now, you have to have it. But what people are going to do is cut down on their driving, and so that they don't use as much gas. But what we're talking about with the bubble is really people would be buying more gas and driving more, and it just doesn't make sense. But it's because of the greed factor that people do it. Okay, as we move on to Soviet-style socialism, again, the Soviets were the first group of people to say we had conquered class inequality, and everybody's the same, but they had a lot of problems with poverty, and that's really still kind of the idea with Soviet-style socialism. Is their government has too much power or a lot of power over citizens. There's really no accountability, and then people still suffer. So there have been some changes in the way that Russia has done that. It has allowed some capitalism in. It's benefited some, but there's still a great number of people who are poor, and they have some health ailments that are really typical of places that are in poverty. Democratic socialism, I know Bernie Sanders was a real fan of that, and he loves Sweden. Our book mentions Norway. But this is kind of an idea that you do have business, but you do have government control, but the government steps in to control the businesses in order to help the population. So here, our book kind of, I think, also approves of these, but says these are, wealthy countries, but then it cuts down on inequality, and it also adds the democratic tradition. So again, it sounds really nice on paper. Now, what our chapter does say is both of these, again, used to be not have any capitalism, but they realize some of the benefits of it. So that's where these mixed economies come in, is maybe instead of using just one of these systems, they do a blend to get the benefits of all the systems and as little of the disadvantages as possible. So China's a great example of that. We've mentioned how well they've done and continue to do with their economy. They used to be a really communist 100%, but they realized that economically that wasn't going to work, and so you can see the slide is titled Authoritarian Capitalism. All right, our book mentions on 436 three types of welfare states. The liberal, like the United States, Canada, Australia, but minimum benefits are provided there. The conservative or corporatist welfare states would be places like France, Germany, and Italy, and they have larger benefits that would include universal insurance that everybody gets, and then, of course, the taxes going to have to be increased to pay for that, and that's kind of like prepaid. And then finally, the social democratic welfare states, like Norway and Sweden, but you get more and more benefits in exchange for, again, higher and higher taxes. Convergence theory is really kind of a way to talk about these economies like the mixed economies, but it's saying that it's becoming more and more common for nations to predict the best aspects of capitalism, of socialism, and maybe even communism and blend it together. That's where it seems to be headed. All right, just a chart that really kind of summarizes some of the things that we've talked about. So if you need to stop the video here, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and go ahead as we're winding down the chapter. What do you think of when you think of security? Our book mentions three types, but economic, so having enough money to be able to maintain a certain standard of living. Environmental is where the environmental resources, natural resources, are really at the forefront. And then human security there really talks more about human rights that people have as individual human beings rather than the security of nations. So what type of human rights should every human being have? Our last few slides are just kind of review, things that you might want to look at a little bit more yourself if this chapter is one that has really been interesting to you. So the next slide talks about peace studies and sociology and action, carrying it out. Should the U.S. culture give greater priority to promoting peace around the world? Do some countries even want peace as we think of it? That might be the opposite side to the question. Here's a basic question that goes to that economic security that we just had a slide on, but Do you know anybody who has not had enough food or was food insecure? And then finally, to review the chapter, our last slide is right here. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for your time. If I can help you, please contact me, and I hope you have a great day.